Welcome to the second episode of Babble with Brennan, presented by MovieBabble. I'm your host, Brennan Dubé, and today's topic is Spider-Man. We'll be ranking the Spider-Man films from our least favorite to our favorite. I have a great guest today, and I'm so excited to get into it. You can check out MovieBabble and some other MovieBabble-related content on MovieBabbleReviews.com. You can also follow us on our Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and check us out on YouTube as well. Welcome to episode 2 of MovieBabble Presents Babble with Brennan. I'm your host, Brennan Dubé. I have a great topic here today. Firstly, I want to introduce my co-host, Collin.
Yeah, that's me. I'm Collin. I'm a college junior and big Spider fan, so I'm excited for today's podcast.
For sure. Collin also works for MovieBabble as well, and we also have the MovieBabble podcast, which comes out every weekend, talking about the top 5 films at the box office on a week-to-week basis. So that's pretty good stuff as well. And yes, as you said, big Spider fan. The topic today is Spider-Man. With the new release of Spider-Man Far From Home just this past week, we decided to rank all the Spider-Man films 1 to 8. This is going to be a pretty fun time. We're going to start with our least favorite, go to our favorite. We're including Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, which came out last December. So we have the 7 live-action films. We have the 3 Raimi films. The 2 Amazing Spider-Man films. Now we have 2 Tom Holland-led Spider-Man films, and then the Into the Spider-Verse, the animated film, which came out last year. As I said, it's going to be a pretty good show. I'm looking forward to it. We're going to throw it over to you for your number 8, and we'll get this thing going.
Yeah, so number 8 was pretty easy for me. In like every movie I've ever seen, there were 3 movies that stand out that I just cannot stand. And one of those is The Amazing Spider-Man 2. So that's my number 8 on the list. I think it's really overcrowded. You see a lot of the signs of Sony meddling with it. Like, to me, it's just the worst one. It's a huge mess.
Yeah, for sure. I actually have that a little bit higher than 8. So I'll swing into my 8 real quick. My number 8 is Spider-Man 3. Spider-Man 3 is a film. This was a tough decision for me. As you said, this is an easy one for you. This was very tough for me between the one you mentioned, Amazing Spider-Man 2, and Spider-Man 3. And I feel with Spider-Man 3, there were so many missed opportunities. It is a crowded film, but I'll definitely get into that a little bit more when you bring it up on your list.
Yeah. So I guess we can move into number 7 then.
Yep, for sure.
And so my number 7 is The Amazing Spider-Man, and I'm assuming mine's probably a little bit lower, and I think a lot of that has to do with nostalgia, but we can get into that a little bit more when we reach it on your list as well.
No, for sure. Yeah, it's a little bit higher than it's number 7. Anyways, my number 7 though is Amazing Spider-Man 2. As you said, that's your number 8. This is a film that I felt was pretty messy, and as you said, there was a lot of meddling that went into it. The Amazing Spider-Man 2 is a movie that it was really tough for me to place either 7 or 8, but for me personally, I'm a huge fan, actually, of the Garfield and Emma Stone relationship. I think that it worked over the course of both films, and I think that was what helped kind of carry this film to make it just a little bit better than Spider-Man 3 for me. Villain-wise, I think this film has worse villains than all the villains in Spider-Man 3. I think they're all a little bit stronger. But here in Amazing Spider-Man 2, I think that it has a little bit more redeeming qualities than Spider-Man 3. I think Spider-Man 3 was just such a letdown in comparison. Maybe that's kind of one of the reasons I had to put it at number 8, because they couldn't finish the trilogy. They couldn't wrap it up. But Amazing Spider-Man 2 is my number 7 personally. And as I can see, you're not a huge fan of the franchise, having them at 8 and 7. So we'll see how that plays out later on in the list, but I'll send it back to you for your number 6 then.
Yeah, and I do want to touch on The Amazing Spider-Man 2 just a little bit.
Yep.
Like, I remember, this is really the only Spider-Man movie that I think is like bad. It doesn't have that many redeeming qualities. I do agree with what you said about Gwen and Peter in the movie. Like, their relationship is really what drives The Amazing Spider-Man. I think they have a much stronger chemistry than even Tobey Maguire and Kirsten Dunst did. particularly in Spider-Man 3, but in the other two as well. And for me, it's just the villains. I think they tried to shoehorn this whole Oscorp like overarching subplot that they started in the first movie and try to kind of connect it to the Doctor Octopus and the Vulture were teased in the credits, and Scorpion, and they tried to incorporate Rhino into that, and Electro was kind of a product of that as well. But then you have Harry Osborn making that really quick turn from this kid who's he's got a disease that took a couple decades to kill his father, and then all of a sudden he's pretty much instantly dying, and spider blood, and there's just a lot of concepts that were thrown in here as Sony was trying to compete with the MCU at the time. This was made just right on the tail of the Avengers and then Iron Man 3, and so this was kind of the beginning craze of the cinematic universe. And I think Sony started with a lot of the problems that we see in the DCEU right now, and so I just see this as more of like a studio systemic failure. That, yeah,
Yeah, you know what?
that's kind of my problem with it.
Yeah, you know what? I have it at number seven. I think that a lot of the issues that you spoke about, I can definitely understand them. The villains, I think, are by far the worst part of the movie. I think Electro, Jamie Foxx is a good actor, and we know that, but I think his performance there was awful, and I think the writing was awful as well for his character. I mean, uh, it was just his character was definitely a mess. And yes, the villains, I can definitely agree with you there. That's definitely the sore spot of the film for me. I still put it at number seven on my 1 through 8, but that's definitely the big sore spot for me.
Yeah, no, no, I agree, and I understand the redeeming qualities behind it, but it's not enough for me.
Understandable.
Yeah, so if you want to move into my number six, then this is one that we have pretty close in positions on the list. Number six for me is Spider-Man 3. But this is really like the tipping point for me of I don't think any movies above this really have would be considered bad. And I mean, Spider-Man 3 is a bad movie, but I love it.
Okay. So that's my number 8. So I want to go into that one a little bit. You have it at 6. That's pretty fair. But I put it at 8 just because of how disappointing it was. Now, it was tough for me to kind of swing that 7 and 8 spot. Amazing Spider-Man 2 and Spider-Man 3. That was really tough for me. But what kind of just kind of pushed me over the edge there was the fact just that Spider-Man 3 felt so much of a letdown with that film. I was looking forward to the kind of trilogy closing, and I think it was gearing up and kind of the paths for leading towards a very solid end to many of the character arcs. I think that they completely we are going full spoilers into these 8 movies. Well, maybe not Far From Home, but the other 7 for sure. Far From Home we probably won't go into too much just because it is pretty new. But the other 7 we will talk about a little bit in depth for sure. So going into Spider-Man 3 here, I think if you remember way back when Harry he's going after Peter, it's pretty early in the movie, and he clunks his head and he kind of forgets what happened. He kind of loses his memory a little bit. He even forgets that he's angry at Spider-Man, which is just something that has kind of been brewing since the very end of the first film. I think that this movie had a great opportunity to pit Harry and Peter against each other, potentially as the main story arc of this final film, but instead they throw in Venom, which is just that was a little bit messy for me. Sandman's character, I didn't mind him in this movie. I actually didn't mind him. I thought that there were some compelling elements to his character with his daughter and such, but I thought just so many characters, so much of a messy movie, and it has a lot of the same problems that the Amazing Spider-Man 2 had. But I just find this movie to be so much of a letdown. That's why I threw it at 8. But you have it at 6. That's not too bad of a spot. And as you said, there's probably no other film on your kind of list 1 through 5 that you dislike really or not a huge fan of. But it's interesting to know that you're this is kind of one of your guilty pleasure films, I guess, eh?
Yeah, and I'm definitely sympathetic towards it because have like read up a lot on the process of making it, and I mean Spider-Man and Spider-Man especially, like I've always had that movie around me growing up, the original, and then Spider-Man 2 has just always been pretty high up there as well. Like I remember always having Raimi's trilogy available to me. But with Spider-Man 3, I actually didn't see it till after it had been out a couple of years, which is just kind of an interesting occurrence there. But like I've read up a lot on it, and just the process of Avi Arad trying to cram Venom into the movie, because Spider-Man 2 didn't bring in as much money as Spider-Man 1, and so they were like, oh, we need to give the fans what we want, and it was just kind of a train wreck. Sam Raimi's original plan was just going to be Harry and Sandman, and then Sony was like, well, you can either put Venom in it or you could not make it. And so he was like, all right, I'll take Sandman out. And they're like, no, we want all three of them. And so it's just a studio mess. And it really like destroyed Sam Raimi for a little while. But
It,
I love like a lot of the ideas that he puts in there. So even though Venom, for me at least, is the weak point of the movie, like the symbiote and Eddie Brock and everything to do with Venom is the weak point because that's what Sam Raimi was the least comfortable with. But I think Sandman has a really good arc. I think like kind of like you said, they start to take Harry in that direction, and I like what they start to do, but they never really capitalize on it. And so I see a lot of the flaws, but I also see kind of the seeds that were planted, and that's why for me this is a little bit higher than either of the Amazing Spider-Man movies.
Okay, I can see that. I mean, looking at my 8 and 7, which is Spider-Man 3 and Amazing Spider-Man 2, I don't hate any of those movies. I think that Spider-Man 3 is a movie that, yeah, there are some elements there, some seeds that you can kind of see, and it's a sad story what happened to Sam Raimi because he did such a good job with the first two films that you really wanted him to kind of wrap it up well. It probably would have been one of the trilogies remembered as one of the great trilogies of all time if you were to land this film anywhere near the first two in terms of quality. But the studio really got involved. It's quite disappointing. I still have it at 8. I don't hate the movie. For me, it's my least favorite Spider-Man movie, with Amazing Spider-Man 2 coming in at number 7 for me, just because even that film, it has its issues, but I still see a couple redeeming qualities in it. I like the cast. I put it at 7. Want to recap your 8, 7, 6 real quick before we go into my number 6?
Yeah. So for me, 8 was The Amazing Spider-Man 2. 7 was The Amazing Spider-Man, and then my number 6 was, of course, Spider-Man 3.
Yep, and my number 6 is a movie that it's number 6, so that's a little bit high up, but it's not a movie that I dislike by any means. And my number 6 is Spider-Man: Homecoming. Um, Spider-Man: Homecoming is a movie that I really enjoy. I've seen it in the last couple years since it came out 3 or 4 times. And it is a really enjoyable film. I remember when it first came out in 2017. Even then, we're far into the MCU. I still 100% sold on the MCU, which is weird. By 2017, I liked a lot of the MCU movies, but I didn't quite see the bigger picture until Infinity War, um, and until kind of the movies just after Homecoming, with Black Panther and such. I didn't quite see everything coming together in such a great way till then. So when Homecoming came out, I was super super excited. But I watched it and I was pleasantly surprised. I really enjoyed it, and I think for what they were trying to do, fitting it into the MCU, I think they did a great job. But that's my number 6. And I do still really like the film. I just found that some elements weren't as strong as some of the other movies on my list, and it's not one that I kind of put up there as one of the greater Spider-Man movies.
Yeah, I actually have that a little bit higher on my list. So we can jump into number 5 and then kind of circle back. But I'll go on to my number 5, which is Spider-Man: Far From Home. And like I said, a few minutes ago, I don't dislike any of these movies. Like and that's what's hard to rank Spider-Man is all these movies, in my opinion, from number 5 on up to number 1 are all an A or an A plus. Like these are all really well done superhero movies, really well done Spider-Man movies. But Far From Home for me, it just I I liked Mysterio as a character, but I don't think he had the most fleshed out of motivations. They he has good motivations, but they don't spend a lot of time on him or on
Right.
what if he won, what the result would be. And for me, that's the weak point. I think they do a really great job with Peter, and going back to that kind of classic Spider-Man storyline of responsibility. But yeah, for me, Far From Home, Mysterio is kind of the weak link here.
Yeah, you know what? It's funny because that's kind of our first one on the list here. That's my number 5 as well. So that's kind of the first one we've had the same. So we both have Spider-Man Far From Home at number five. I really enjoyed Spider-Man Far From Home. I liked it a little bit more than Homecoming, which I had at six. I only liked it a little bit more because I thought that it fleshed out the elements that I thought were okay about the first film. I really, really liked the chemistry between Zendaya and Tom Holland. I actually think that it was really good and really charming. I liked seeing the post Endgame MCU, the post Endgame Earth, because I just thought there was a really cool element, and I hope that that is something that they touch on in future MCU movies as well. I kind of want to see the aftermath on a small scale. So I think Spider-Man was the perfect character to kind of have your first follow-up movie to Endgame with, and I like Far From Home just a little bit more than Homecoming, but we'll get back into Homecoming when we reach it on your list. But that's my number five as well. So I'll turn it back to you for your number four.
Yeah. So, and again, I don't dislike any of these movies. Um, but moving on to my number four is the first Spider-Man, Sam
Okay.
Raimi's Spider-Man from 2002.
Yep.
And you can say a lot about the original Spider-Man movies, but kind of Marvel as we know it starts from here. And I'll touch on it a little bit later when we get to it on your list.
For sure. So that's your number four. My number four is The Amazing Spider-Man. You know what? I grew up with the Raimi films, but I was aware and excited about the first Amazing Spider-Man. With the Raimi films, there was no real internet at that time, right? There was, especially when the first two came out, uh, and even the third, like there wasn't really an open source of kind of getting on the internet and finding a lot of things out for yourself for someone who's a kid. Whereas nowadays you'll see it everywhere. So I just kind of enjoyed the Raimi films when they were just around at my house, and I just enjoyed them in that respect. And I think Spider-Man 3 is the first movie I really remember going to theaters to see. I know I saw some before that in theaters, but Spider-Man 3 was the first one I remember going to see. But by the time The Amazing Spider-Man comes out, we kind of are getting a little bit more into the age of the internet, and I have access, and I am hyped for this movie for at least a year before it comes out. I'm really looking forward to it. And it's number four on my list. I know it's seven on yours, but it's four on mine because I actually really do enjoy this movie. This is a film that I thought they did a lot of things well in. I like the vibe, the tone of this film. I know they promised a darker Spider-Man with the Amazing Spider-Man franchise. I don't know if they delivered on that respect fully, but there were a lot of things I liked about this movie. I think the Lizard and Kurt Connor's character is the weakest point of the film. I think the CGI is not too great on the Lizard. I don't like the design of the character, and I think that Kurt Connors is pretty one-dimensional in the film. But as I said, what I liked about Amazing Spider-Man 2, Andrew Garfield and Emma Stone, I think Gwen Stacy, Peter Parker, there was a great interplay there. They had a great relationship, and I really liked that part of the film. I also liked seeing a little bit more of a elongated origin story. In Raimi's Spider-Man, which is higher than this one on my list, it's kind of a rushed beginning. I mean, it's not a rush, but they do it in such a short amount of time. He gets bitten pretty quick. He becomes Spider-Man pretty quick. Whereas in The Amazing Spider-Man, it's a little bit prolonged, and you get to kind of see a little bit of his life at home a little bit more with Aunt May and Uncle Ben. And I must say, I think every single Aunt May, all three, are quite good. I didn't dislike any of the Aunt Mays in the franchise. What's your take on Aunt May and Uncle Ben in every Spider-Man film?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and I've talked about it a little bit, but my preference is always going to be the Raimi movies. But I think, yeah, like Aunt May, they've managed to do something different with her each time, and I think that's one of the Amazing Spider-Man's victories is the fact that this is the same set of characters and the same story, in a basic sense of Aunt May, Uncle Ben, and Peter, but they managed to do it differently and to kind of shake it up a little bit, especially with Aunt May. I think Martin Sheen's Uncle Ben is kind of boring because he just kind of followed the standard Uncle Ben beats. But I think Aunt May manages to come across in a much different way than Rosemary Harris did in the original Spider-Man movies, and I think that's one of the reasons why the Amazing Spider-Man stands out. I definitely agree with you about the Lizard. I think he starts off promising. He's a scientist just trying to cure himself and get back to a normal life, but he kind of devolves into a sky beam, gas the world, turn him into lizards, and I think that's where the Amazing Spider-Man falls apart. But yeah, those are kind of my thoughts on the Amazing Spider-Man.
I really liked Andrew Garfield as Spider-Man. I really, really liked him as Spider-Man. I think as Peter Parker, my favorite still is Tobey Maguire. I think Tom Holland does a really, really respectable job in both um, roles, Spider-Man and Peter Parker. But Andrew Garfield, I think, was terrific as Spider-Man. I love the way he acted. I actually, personally, I know this was controversial back when these films came out, but I really like the suit in The Amazing Spider-Man. I really like that
Hmm.
suit. The color scheme, the design, I really liked it. When you get kind of close-up shots, the texture doesn't look as kind of tight and clean as in uh, Homecoming and Far From Home and in the Raimi films. But just kind of a basic look at the costumes. I really enjoy the Amazing Spider-Man just for the costumes as well. And I think Sally Field's great. As you said, yeah, Martin Sheen can be a little bit boring as Uncle Ben, just because it feels so recycled, even though it only happened once before. It just feels it's something we've all seen before already, and that's one reason I really liked. I really like what they're doing with Homecoming and Far From Home. It feels really fresh with this new Spider-Man. It's kind of a different take on it, and I think that was really necessary. You already have two films that touch on the origin story. You didn't need to tell the exact same one, so I gotta give props to Homecoming and Far From Home in that respect. But I'm a person who will always like The Amazing Spider-Man. I don't love the film, but I think it's a very good movie. It's fourth on my list just for the facts that I really like the film. I think the action sequences are good, and I even dig the scenes where it's from his point of view, the first person. I know a lot of people said it looks like a video game. I know a lot of people said um, that it was unnecessary, but I actually enjoy those scenes. I think they are fun to watch. It's number four on my list, but my five, four, and three can all kind of really switch around. I think it was tough to place these films, but I had to put it at number four because it's a movie that I really enjoyed and I liked Andrew Garfield's Spider-Man a lot. There are some issues as we touched on, but that's my number four.
Okay, so you want to move on to number three then?
Yeah, for sure. So we'll move on to the number three slot for sure. Yeah, take it away.
Yeah, so and for me, this was a movie that I really struggled to place, just because it is so much different than all the other movies. But my number three is Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, and it's like it follows so many different rules just because it is an animated movie, and just because it is pretty much the only animated movie of its style. But I can kind of talk about why it's my number three and not higher or lower once we get to it on your list.
Yeah, for sure. My number three is one that you've already placed on your list, and my number three is the original Spider-Man from 2002, Sam Raimi Spider-Man. This was so tough for me to place because I have Far From Home at five, I have The Amazing Spider-Man at four, and I have this at three. I kind of look at The Amazing Spider-Man and the 2002 Spider-Man as very similar movies because they're both telling an origin story that follow very similar beats, and um, where the two movies differ, in my opinion, is the villain and some of the consequences. I think that you look at the original Spider-Man in 2002, and when Peter Parker doesn't stop that thief, and that thief ends up killing Uncle Ben, it hits a lot harder than in the Amazing Spider-Man when he doesn't stop the thief, and that thief ends up killing Uncle Ben.
Yeah.
um, I think it hits a lot harder in Raimi's 2002 Spider-Man. It feels really, really, really familiar in The Amazing Spider-Man. And also another thing is the villain, as I said, Willem Dafoe's Green Goblin is a really, really good villain. I wish that he got more time in this movie. I mean, he got a lot of screen time. He was fleshed out pretty good, but he was just so good that I would have liked to see even more. And you compare him to the Lizard in The Amazing Spider-Man, he's not. Or sorry, he's way better. Green Goblin's way better, and that's the reason I had to put this three above The Amazing Spider-Man. While I really do like the performances in The Amazing Spider-Man, I think that this movie really captures consequences. It captures the villain and it captures the magic of Spider-Man a little bit more. And I also just love the New York vibe of Raimi's films. And this did come out a year after 9/11, and I think it was really important um, that this movie did well, and it was huge for the city of New York to have a movie like this and have a hero like Spider-Man. I know it's fictional, but it's something that people use movies as an escape, and I think it came out at a huge time in history in 2002. It's my number three for sure. It's a movie that I'll always revisit. I think it's a terrific origin story, one of the better origin stories in terms of superhero films over the years. So yeah, that's my number three for sure.
Yeah, and I mean, I had this a little bit lower, just barely at number four. But I think this is uh one of the best superhero movies of all time. I mean, this was coming at a point where pretty much the last big superhero movie had been Batman and Robin, and then you'd had X-Men 2 years before. So there wasn't a whole lot, and this really sets a lot of the tone and style of even, the MCU right now. I completely agree with your take on the Green Goblin, as well as with the Bandit. When Peter and Uncle Ben's relationship, I think, is a lot more cemented, and there's kind of this really strong argument they have right before, and then Peter lies to Uncle Ben, and then leaves, uh, doesn't stop the bandit, and then the bandit kills his uncle. And I think, like you said, that hits home a lot more. The Green Goblin, I think they just did a great job, kind of showing, um, kind of in opposition to Spider-Man. You have a hero and a villain that are both really struggling with duality. Does Peter choose to be Spider-Man or choose to be Peter? Does Norman choose to be Norman, or let the Green Goblin take control? And I think it just crescendos really well. And I mean, the effects don't always hold up. This is a 17-year-old movie at this point, but the effects still hold up pretty well. The fight between the Green Goblin and Spider-Man at the end is still really cool to watch today. And this is just a great origin story.
Yeah, no, for sure. I want to kind of touch on it a little bit more as well because this is a movie that it is really, really well done. And one of the reasons that I really had to place this movie a little bit above The Amazing Spider-Man's, as I said, was Uncle Ben's death and the meaning it had. And that's also one of the reasons why I put Spider-Man 3 at number 8, just because of the way they brought back Uncle Ben's death in Spider-Man 3.
Hmm.
I just didn't like it. I wasn't a big fan, and I thought it was borderline disrespect to this movie,
Yeah.
because I thought it was perfect the way it was. I didn't want to revisit that. So that's kind of another reason I put Spider-Man 3 at 8. But I have Raimi's original 2002 Spider-Man here at number 3, and it did definitely pave the way for the future of superhero films as we know it. I mean, the X-Men was a pretty big movie domestically. Spider-Man was a massive movie worldwide, and it was the first movie to ever gross $100 million in its opening weekend. So it was a massive film, massive hit. And even, yeah, still today, it does hold up decently. Visual effects are getting better every year. So, I mean, who knows? Maybe 10 years from now, we'll look at The Lion King coming out this summer and we'll say that's bad visuals. But who knows? But that's kind of the way visual effects are. You can't really fault a movie for that, especially considering this movie was nominated for Best Visual Effects at the Oscars back in 2002. So in its era, great effects. Even today, they hold up decently. You can still watch this film, really enjoy it, and it is one of the best superhero movies of all time. A great origin story. So that's my number 3. Before we head into the top 2, we'll do a quick run through here. So my number 8 is Spider-Man 3. My number 7 is Amazing Spider-Man 2. My number 6 is Homecoming. My number 5 is Far From Home. Still really dig those movies, but had to put them at 6 and 5. Two great movies, though. My number 4 is The Amazing Spider-Man, and my number 3 is Spider-Man, Raimi's 2002 Spider-Man. Let's run through your 8 through 3 before we head into our top 2.
Yes, my number 8 is The Amazing Spider-Man 2, and then The Amazing Spider-Man is in seventh. Sixth is Spider-Man 3. Five is Far From Home. Four is the original Spider-Man, and three is Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse.
Awesome. Alrighty, so we'll get into your number 2. What would that be?
Yeah, so my number two, I think this is the one we disagreed with the most on, is actually Spider-Man Homecoming. Um, and yeah, because I think you had this.
I got a
Well, I know
6.
you had this.
I'm
Yeah, I know you had this a lot lower than I did. Um, but for me, I really love the Vulture and the twist they did with that. Like when Michael Keaton opens the door, I think that's one of the best moments in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And I think for me, Vulture is really what sets this apart, as well as Iron Man and Spider Man and Tony Stark's relationship with Peter. It really established something that it didn't completely climax in this movie, but really climaxed in Infinity War, and then again in Endgame, and really just kind of paved the way for how Spider-Man could be different and explored differently as a character. This is the third live action Spider-Man, but now we're getting to see him, be Tony Stark's protege and be younger and be this kid that, is trying to find out his place in a world where when he's introduced, you have Loki bringing aliens down on New York and Ultron dropping cities from the sky. And here's this kid who's, just fighting a guy over basically a bunch of alien junk. And yeah, I think it's just really well done. And it's one of my favorite MCU movies and definitely my number two Spider-Man movie.
Yeah, so I had this one at six, but I by no means didn't enjoy this movie. This is a really good movie, and Vulture is the best part about it, as you said. That reveal at the door, it is one of the best MCU moments. It's also one of the best Spider-Man moments. And upon rewatching all eight of these movies for the purpose of developing this list, Vulture is probably my second favorite villain. Before the rewatch, I probably would have said Green Goblin at number two, but Vulture is probably my second favorite. I think Michael Keaton did great in the role. He's a motivated villain. I think of all eight films, he might be the most motivated villain.
Hmm.
I think that he has great intentions. Well, I'm not going to say great intentions, but I think his intentions are they're written really great, and I think that you see his purpose, you see what he wants to do, you see his goal, and you understand it because of his character and what kind of he had to go through. And I thought they set that up really well. So that's a great villain. That's definitely a great part of this film, and I have it at six, but for me, it's still pretty much an 8 out of 10 movie. I still really enjoy this movie, and it was so tough for me to really kind of solidify there in that sixth spot. But I did like Far From Home a little bit more, so that's why I had to put it at five. But Homecoming, yeah, six for me, two for you though. That's pretty good. I mean, I'm looking forward to see what Tom Holland has to do because I really like Tom Holland in this role. I think after Homecoming, I liked him. I was still a little bit skeptical because I am an Amazing Spider-Man fan. I am a fan of Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man films, but I still really like the movie. But with him, I wasn't completely sold. Then you see Infinity War and Endgame, I was sold. And now Far From Home, he really has solidified himself as a really good Spider-Man and a solid Peter Parker as well. So you know what? I want to see another trilogy after this one of Tom Holland. I want to see years and years from now a Logan style Spider-Man with Tom Holland in the lead. I want to see Tom Holland kind of carry this character for a long time and us kind of grow with him and cinema kind of grow with him. I think that'd be really cool. So yeah, it's my number six. Your number two. I still enjoyed it, but seems you enjoyed it a lot more.
Yep, and my only real complaint with Homecoming and Far From Home is that the villains in these movies are more like Iron Man is the reason why they're Spider-Man villains, right? Like they don't come into Spider-Man's life because they have a problem with Spider-Man or their paths intersect. It's more like they have a problem with Iron Man and Spider-Man happens to be there, kind of crossing paths with them. And so I would like to see someone like the Green Goblin in the original Spider-Man trilogy, or someone that really has a genuine beef with Spider-Man, not Tony Stark. Um,
Oh,
it,
100%. I
that's
think
really
that'd
my
be
main complaint.
yeah, that'd be a pretty cool kind of addition to the future of this franchise. Because when you said that, I didn't really think of that. You're right. It's kind of Iron Man that has caused the two Spider-Man villains, and I'd like to see I'd like to see one of those OG villains come in and try to take on Spidey. That'd be really cool. But anyways, my number two is Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. This was a phenomenal movie. It's top three of my favorite films of 2018. I believe I have it at two. It's a really 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 good movie. It's a movie that I think it's the least um, uh, divisive superhero movie, arguably of all time, in my opinion. I know The Dark Knight is a movie that is always regarded as phenomenal, top notch, best of the best superhero stuff. But there's always going to be people who hate on it um, just because it's so good. That's what happens when you get that popular, get that good. But with a movie like Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, I just don't recall seeing anyone really trash on this movie. This is such a phenomenal film through and through. The animation is just fantastic. It's revolutionary. It's so cool to watch. The colors are just incredible. It really just comes out of the screen really. It was such a fun theater experience. This is a movie that I didn't really have many expectations for this film. I didn't know how it was going to turn out, but it was cool to kind of see the Miles Morales story in the Spider-Man universe. Then I see this film, and it was just phenomenal. It really blew me away. It's funny, it's relevant, it's enjoyable. The action sequences are great. I think this movie has heart. This movie teaches a lot of good lessons. It has some great themes, some great coming of age themes as well, and themes of responsibility. And most Spider-Man movies have those themes, but I think this one really hits it home really well. And the Stanley cameo in the store. That was really solid to see. That was unexpected when I first saw it. I think it was really good. That's my number two. And I know you wanted to say a couple things about this film, so I'll let you take it away on Into the Spider-Verse.
Yeah, and I mean, I kind of touched on it a little bit earlier, but it's so hard to um, rank this movie compared to all the other Spider-Man movies, just because it is an animated movie. It is a very distinct comic book style, and it just plays by completely different rules. I mean, you have a pig character that can pull a mallet out of his pocket and then put it back in like it's nothing. Like it's just it plays by such different rules, but I think they really do a good job giving Peter and Miles really meaningful character arcs.
For
And
sure.
Kingpin. You have a ton of villains in this movie too. You have so for MovieBabble, I ranked all the Spider-Man villains, and there's like 7 or 8 in this movie alone. I mean, you have Doc Ock, you have Prowler, you have Kingpin, you have Scorpion, you have the Green Goblin, you have just a ton of these villains, and it manages to balance them all. And yeah, most of them are just kind of bit characters. I think the Green Goblin is only in one scene, but it really juggles them all. It juggles, 5 different Spider-Men really well. While at the same time, you have Peter Parker getting a really meaningful lesson about Spider-Man and fatherhood and redemption, and Miles learning to become a hero and growing up and filling in these massive shoes left by his Peter Parker. And like this movie is, if it's not perfect, it's pretty close. Like this is just such an amazing animated movie.
Yeah, for sure. I was really blown away by this, and I think the funniest part of the movie is Nick Cage's
Yeah,
Spider-Man Noir. Nick Cage's Spider-Man Noir made me laugh so many times. That's a really, really, really standout in this film. And as I talked about previously, motivations. That's a huge part of what makes a villain great. I think there's so many one-dimensional villains in superhero movies. It seems like in the MCU they're starting to get better. Spider-Man's had a few, but this film they aren't one-dimensional. I think Kingpin even when you see kind of the backstory with his family, um, uh, he has motivations, and you kind of see why characters are in the places they're in. And I really dug this film a lot, and I'll continue to praise it and kind of spread the word about it because it was a really good movie, and it is one that, as I said, you don't often see people talk bad about this movie. I think people are really universally in line with this thing, and for this to be an Oscar winner for Best Animated Feature, that's pretty cool as well. It did really good at almost all the award shows this past this past year, last year, and it's pretty. It's just really cool that this thing actually happened, and I want to see more because it was just so much fun. But I also hope that when we do see more, it doesn't fall apart because the magic in this movie is there, and I really enjoyed Into the Spider-Verse. I enjoyed it a lot.
yeah. I mean, I have next to zero problems with this movie. Like it's just an amazing movie.
For sure. So we've got our 8 through 2s decided, and if you have been kind of listening along well, you'll notice that we both haven't mentioned the same movie yet. So I want to turn it over to you for number one. What's your favorite Spider-Man movie?
Yeah, so this is not only my favorite Spider-Man movie, but this is my favorite movie of all time. I'm talking about Spider-Man 2. Like this and Shrek 2. I remember seeing those. I don't think I saw them together because I don't know if they were out at the same time. But those are the two movies that I remember seeing first in the movie theater. I would have been, I think, 7 at the time, 6 or 7. Um, and I just like I've always loved this movie. The older I get, the more I appreciate it and just see like just how incredible this movie is. um, I mean, from kind of exploring the story with Peter Moore, and even the fact that he's not Spider-Man for like 30 to 45 minutes of this movie, and you also have a meaningful arc for Doctor Octopus, and he doesn't even become Doc Ock until this movie's almost 45 minutes into the movie. You get to explore him as a character. Mary Jane gets a meaningful arc. Harry gets a meaningful arc. Aunt May gets a meaningful arc. And there's just so many characters that it juggles really well. The effects are amazing. The train fight still holds up to this very day. J. Jonah Jameson, he's been talked about a lot lately in the past week or so. But he really, J.K. Simmons really like inhabits that character in this movie, and it just does a lot of things, and it does them all really, really well.
For sure. This is my number one as well. Sam Raimi's 2004 Spider-Man 2. This is a phenomenal, phenomenal movie. It's a movie that I think a lot of people still consider to be the best Spider-Man movie. I think probably if you were to poll 1,000 people, um, this would probably be number one on their favorite Spider-Man movie. And it is just so good. It's so good. It's just an incredible film overall. It's one of my favorite superhero movies. It's up there with it's top three for my favorite superhero movies. It's also one of my favorite movies. This is just such a wonderful, wonderful film, and it does so many things right. I think there's a strong undertone of emotional drama there between MJ and Peter Parker that isn't always said, and it leads into the end of the movie when she sees who Spider-Man really. She sees the reveal, and you really feel it. And Raimi did a terrific job at directing this film. The train fight scene is one of the best in comic book movie history and action movie history. It's so memorable. It's so incredible. It's a wonderful scene for sure, and it's an uplifting scene as well. And it still does hold up today. And the visual effects in this movie, compared to 2 years prior with the original Spider-Man, they're crazy. They really made a lot of improvements with Spider-Man 2 in terms of VFX, and that just goes to show how fast and how rapid visual effects can change, and how good they can become over just a short period of time. But yeah, Doctor Octopus is arguably my favorite villain in cinema. I went crazy over this movie as a kid just because of Doc Ock. I mean, looking back over all eight of these Spider-Man films. I really like Tobey Maguire as Peter Parker. I like him as Spider-Man. He is great as Peter Parker, and I think the dry humor in the Raimi films works. But I always wanted to be when you want to be a villain, sometimes that happens. I always wanted to be Doc Ock. I always thought he was such a cool villain. I loved the arms, and he had motivations as well. That's the theme. He had motivations. He went through a lot, and one scene I just want to bring up is the scene when he's in the hospital after the accident, after the experiment, and the arms wake up. Do you remember that
Hmm.
scene? That's a scene that Sam Raimi flexed a little bit of his horror talent because he's a traditional horror film director, and that's a wonderful scene as well. A scary scene where they definitely take it a step forward in terms of how much they're going to test the boundaries. That's a pretty good scene. But yeah, this movie is just phenomenal. It's a movie that I'll always hold near and dear because it is just so good. I have a few tiny issues with this movie, and it's one issue that I have with the entire trilogy, and that is that I like James Franco a lot. I think he did good in these movies, but I wish that they touched more on his vengeance with Spider-Man.
Hmm.
Um, uh, I think that it happens, you know about it, but they don't flesh it out a lot. And I would have loved to see that a little bit more in this movie, and then also in the third film. Third film kind of messed things up with that story arc, but yeah, this is a wonderful film, and it's one that was a huge box office success. But as you said, it's a shame that it didn't make as much as the first because I think we would have seen a solid end to the trilogy in Spider-Man 3 if this movie was an even bigger hit at the box office.
Yeah, and I mean, kind of touching on how Sam Raimi, gets to flex his horror muscles with this movie. You definitely see like where they let him go a little bit nuts with it, or let him, take it in more extreme directions. Because I mean, Spider-Man, the 2002 movie was expected to be big, but it was just massive. I mean, $100 million opening weekend was unheard of at the time. It was just a ridiculous success that people didn't really know that superhero movies could have. And you see where they let Sam Raimi kind of go nuts with it in the second one, and then you definitely see where they pull back and are like, okay, we're in charge now. With the third
Yeah.
one, even though they really, it's not like Spider-Man 2 was a bomb. Like this was still a huge success.
No,
It
for
just
sure.
wasn't as big a success. And Sony, in typical Sony fashion, kind of freaked out. And that's how Spider-Man 3 came to be.
Yeah, no, I think that the studio needs to have a little bit more faith. I mean, yeah, I wasn't trying to say that it wasn't a success at all. This movie was a huge success, but it just didn't quite make as much as the first one did, and that kind of changes the studio's outlook a little bit. I mean, this movie still went on to make $783 million, which in 2004 was huge. The first movie made 821 million, so there's only like a $36 million gap between the two, but that was enough for the studio to come in and kind of screw up uh, Raimi's plans for the third film, which is upsetting. But Spider-Man 2 is a movie that I can't praise it enough. And since there's going to be a lot more Spider-Man films to come, I hope that this is one that doesn't get forgotten. I don't think it will from our generation and the generations behind, but I'd love for this movie to get passed on to younger people as well, because it's a really good movie and I think it holds up so well today. Terrific, terrific superhero film, and it's one that I can't praise enough.
And I mean, it's interesting to look at just how the Spider-Man trilogy has kind of evolved over the years. So Raimi's movies have a really strong internet presence now. And Spider-Man 3 is one of those movies that was pretty much universally loathed when it came out. But now a lot of the opinion on it is flipped a lot, kind of like how the Star Wars prequels have. And you have a lot of these, kids like myself that grew up with it and were like, no, this yeah, this is bad, but we love it anyways. Like we're committed to loving it. And
Yes,
yeah.
yeah, Spider-Man 3 feels a lot like a prequel, like a Star Wars
Yeah.
prequel.
Oh yeah.
No, you're right, 100% it does. It feels like one of those guilty pleasures that people love to hate but also love, right? And yeah, that's kind of the way it went. But I mean, the first two movies in the Raimi trilogy, you can't really deny that they're both great movies. And just Spider-Man 2, it hits all the boxes. It checks off everything that makes a good film. And I also wanted to touch on, I don't believe I have yet in talking about the Raimi films, but Danny Elfman's score,
Oh
um,
yeah.
because it is phenomenal and it is by far better than anything that is. I mean, I'm a huge Michael Giacchino fan. He does the score for the newer Spider-Man films. He's probably my first or second favorite composer, up with Hans Zimmer. But Danny Elfman captured Spider-Man with this score. This score is phenomenal. The first movie, second movie, terrific. The third movie, Christopher Young came in and composed the film, but he still used a lot of the elements that Danny Elfman had from the first two films. But the score is just so good. One of the best superhero film scores ever, in my opinion. It's just wonderful. Elfman really hit it at the ballpark with his score for the Raimi Spider-Man films.
Yeah, I mean the Spider-Man theme that he made for the first movie is iconic. Like if you go to my local movie theater, I don't know if it's a nationwide thing, but they play film scores in the lobby, and like I'll still walk in there and hear the Spider-Man theme that Danny Elfman did. Like it's instantly recognizable. It's so good. It really captures Spider-Man, and even the Doc Ock theme he did for Spider-Man 2, I think holds up just as well.
No, I agree for sure, and you gotta love when the Raimi films start and you hear that theme.
Yeah,
He did a terrific job with the score. I mean, the scores also in A Homecoming and Far From Home, they're great. Michael Giacchino does a really good job there, but I think that Danny Elfman's score for Spider-Man is one of the most iconic um, comic book movie scores of all time for sure. And there will be a lot more to come over the upcoming years, but I think Elfman's score will definitely stand the test of time. So before we wrap it up here and say goodbye, I want to kind of run through our 8 through 1 again real quick. So we'll let you start there. What's your 8 through 1?
yeah. So my number 8 is The Amazing Spider-Man 2. Number 7 is The Amazing Spider-Man. Then Spider-Man 3 in number 6. Spider-Man Far From Home in number 5. Spider-Man, the 2002 movie, number 4. Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse in number 3. Number 2 is Spider-Man Homecoming. And number 1 is, of course, Spider-Man 2.
For sure. My number 8 is Spider-Man 3. Number 7, The Amazing Spider-Man 2. Number 6, Spider-Man Homecoming. Number five is Spider-Man Far From Home, which we both had at five. Number four for me is The Amazing Spider-Man. Number three is the original 2002 Spider-Man. Number two is Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. And number one, which we also had the same, is Spider-Man 2. All eight of these films, they have interesting characters through and through. All eight of these films are, I think, memorable for different reasons. What's three of your kind of favorite Spider-Man moments? Let's try to, actually, what's your favorite from each of the different four Spider-Mans that we've seen? Spider-Verse, Tom Holland, Andrew Garfield, and Tobey Maguire. Give me a moment from each.
Okay. So I'll start with Tom Holland. So I think his introduction and like his airport scene in Civil War was really just like a really nice and fun way to meet the character. He comes in pretty late in the movie, but you instantly know like this is why this Spider-Man is different. This is how he fits within the universe, and it was just a great way to put him in. So that's mine for Tom Holland. For Andrew Garfield, um, it's gonna be a tough one. I think really just his moments uh, with Gwen. I think his relationship. I don't know if I have a particular one, but I think just his relationship with Gwen is really the most memorable thing that he did as a character. And Into the Spider Verse, it's got to be the scene where Miles really gets control of his powers, and that iconic Spider Verse shot where he's falling up through the flame or through the frame, and just really exploring who he is. And then it's hard to pick with Tobey Maguire. Um,
Yep.
I think my favorite meme one is Pizza Time, when he drops the pizza off. But I think the train fight in Spider-Man 2, just you really push a lot of like Spider-Man's powers and a lot of what they could do with visual effects in the day. And I think it's just the best sequence in the Raimi trilogy.
There you go. I shouldn't have let you on first, man. That was pretty good. um, but I have to agree with the Tobey Maguire one. I think that the train sequence, it's very powerful. It's very moving, and it is huge. Besides that, his monologues are funny. Kind of the opening monologues for the films and the closing, they're pretty funny. But there are a lot of great moments. You have three films, so you got a lot to choose from. But the train sequence is one that always will stand out. And another one I agree with you with is the Miles Morales in Into the Spider Verse. I thought that was a great moment, especially you see the camera kind of panning up on him. That was great. That's kind of when you know that this movie's about to take a different turn. He's really honed his powers, so to speak. I also love his first introduction with Gwen Stacy when they kind of ran into each other
Hmm.
um, in the school. That was pretty good. And it kind of just showed the charm of his character as well and hers. And I thought it was a really cool sequence as well. Going into the Andrew Garfield ones, I did really dig him as Spider-Man. So one of the moments I really enjoyed was, I don't know if you remember it, but it's in the first Amazing Spider-Man. You got cars getting tossed off a bridge by the lizard, and there's one car that's hanging from one of Spidey's webs connected to the bridge, and there's a little kid in it. He goes down, and the kid's afraid, and he gives him his mask to put on.
Hmm.
Um, to kind of help him through the situation. I thought that was pretty good, but I think as Spider-Man, all of his kind of witty remarks, they're always fun. And then the with the Tom Holland Spider-Man, I think we've had a lot of pretty good moments thus far. But I just really like any interplay he has with Tony Stark, and especially, I mean, this is more touching on Iron Man, but when they were reunited in Endgame, kind of seeing each other
Hmm.
again, I thought that was a pretty kind of good moment, and it was in that moment that it's kind of starting to signal that the end is probably coming for Tony. I mean, after that, you see Doctor Strange with the one up and all the other stuff. But anything with those two is really great. I also liked um, what you said. Also, in the airport, I think that was a really good introduction to Spider-Man, and that was something that really made me excited about Tom Holland as Spider-Man moving forward. Just the fact that he can be funny, he can be charming, and he feels like he is a high school kid. He's not looking like he's 30 in high school.
Hmm.
um, but yeah, I like what they're doing with it. So that's kind of some of my favorite moments for sure. I want to thank you though for coming on. That was a pretty good show. It's pretty cool that we had the same number one. Spider-Man 2 is a movie that is definitely one that we hold near and dear for sure. It's a great film overall. This is such a great character though, and I think there's so much more story to tell. If you looked back, way back in the day, probably back when the first couple Spider-Mans came out, would you have expected that we would have had a Mysterio by now?
No, and I mean, Mysterio has kind of always been looked at as like we can't like the villain that nobody could really figure out a use for. He's always been very gimmicky, and it's crazy that like we've had a really good Vulture, we've had a really good Mysterio in within 2 years of each other.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that just shows how promising the future is with the Marvel Cinematic Universe and Spider-Man villains. It'd be cool to see a Sinister Six one day. It'd be
Hmm.
cool to see that come to fruition. I'd like to see a lot of the kind of original Spider-Man villains come back into the mix. But there have been a lot of great moments with this character, a lot of great films, and it's just pretty cool that he's kind of transcended cinema on a global scale. And we're going to see this year the first Spider-Man movie to hit $1 billion, which is pretty wild with Far From Home and just the impact that Endgame has had on that character and everything that happened there. So it's pretty cool. But I want to thank you again for coming on. It was a great show. And I'm going to wrap it up here. So I want to say thank you guys for listening for sure. It was a great talk with Collin. You can check us out on MovieBabbleReviews.com. We have podcasts weekly with the MovieBabble podcast where we do discuss latest box office news. I'll be back in a couple weeks with the next episode of Babble with Brennan. But for sure, this was a great show, and it's always fun to talk Spider-Man. So see you next time. Welcome to the second episode of Babble with Brennan, presented by MovieBabble. I'm your host, Brennan Dubé, and today's topic is Spider-Man. We'll be ranking the Spider-Man films from our least favorite to our favorite. I have a great guest today, and I'm so excited to get into it. You can check out MovieBabble and some other MovieBabble-related content on MovieBabbleReviews.com. You can also follow us on our Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and check us out on YouTube as well.